Hello, and welcome to session 10 of our Bible study, Apocalyptic and Pandemic, What Revelation is Telling Us Today. This is the next to the last session of our Bible study, and we're going to begin with chapter 19, and we'll do just a little bit of backtracking. But what we've seen so far is the very symbolic and dramatic structure of the book of Revelation, which is designed to tell a story, to make a point, and the point is that God is in charge, basically, and will make everything right, but at the end of time. So Revelation 19, beginning with verse 11 through 21. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True. Now, we did read this portion last time, and I just wanted to backtrack because this series of visions, 7 visions, are kind of a set. So wanted to be sure to not lose that. Okay. So anyway, saw heaven open. There was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. He has a name inscribed that no one knows but himself. He's clothed in a robe dipped in blood. His name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of the God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of the mighty, the flesh of horses, their riders, the flesh of all, both slave and free, both small and great. Then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth, with their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed in its presence the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse, the sword that came from his mouth, and all the birds were gorged with its flesh. And so this is the beginning of the final 7 visions of the end of the evil age and the beginning of God's age. There have been 6 series of 7 visions each, describing the evils and wickedness that have resulted in the persecution of faithful Christians. And remember, this vision is directed toward those faithful Christians, those 7 churches in Asia Minor, Gentile Christian churches who were under such severe persecution. The cosmic battle of evil against good is depicted as supernatural conflicts. Still, the powers of evil remain intransigent. The 7th series of 7 visions marks the climax of the apocalyptic drama, the downfall of Satan and the powers of darkness, the end of this evil age. A new heaven and a new earth are revealed, with heaven coming down to earth, and God rules. The first 6 series of visions were previews of this 7th, and the 7th series represents the culmination of the downfall of Satan. Satan gets his accountability. In the first vision of this last series, the conquering Christ is on a white horse, and he rides out and with a heavenly army defeats Satan, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. Heaven declares that Christ is justified in this war against evil. He rides like a warrior with eyes like fire, crowned with many crowns. Somewhat like the beast. Remember the vision of the beast with the many crowns on the different appendages. His unique name was inscribed, probably on his head, maybe on his forehead, and only he knows the name, but we can speculate that maybe that name was Jesus. We can speculate from reading Philippians 2, verse 10. And it's possible even that each instance of a secret name known only to God and that person is actually Jesus. He was clothed, Jesus, in a robe dipped in blood, the blood of his enemies. And this kind of warrior, bloodthirsty Jesus is not the usual image we have, but it's what fit in this apocalyptic drama. The armies of heaven were wearing fine linen, white and pure. They were likely the martyrs on white horses. Those whom the power of evil had struck down, well, they now strike back. Jesus had a sharp sword from his mouth, and that references Revelation chapter 1, verse 16, to strike down the nations, to rule them with a rod of iron, a reference back to Psalm 2, verse 9, and also to the wisdom of Solomon, an apocryphal book, chapter 18, verses 15 to 16. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. Again, that refers back to that winepress image of Revelation 14, verses 19 to 20. The second vision is of the defeated Antichrist and the false prophets who are thrown alive into a lake of fire. And the birds, in a kind of an Alfred Hitchcock-like way, were gathered by an angel to eat the remains from the battle. And this is a reference back to Ezekiel chapter 39, verses 1 to 20, the destruction of Gog and Magog. Their armies, the people from the earth, were all destroyed. This carnage of the followers of the Antichrist stood in contrast to the messianic feast of the saved, which was just a very familiar image that the salvation, the end of time, heaven would be a messianic banquet. And this horrible carnage is in contrast. The reign of the Antichrist is representing the reign of evil Caesars and of the emperor cult. The lake of fire referred to the Greek understanding of hell, or Jerusalem's garbage dump named Gehenna. This was not the Jewish image of Sheol, such as in Daniel 12:2. The followers of the beast were to be raised in the second resurrection and then suffering eternal punishment. And that references back to 2 Thessalonians 2, 8 to 10, and in the Jewish apocalyptic book, 2 Baruch, chapter 40, verses 1 to 4. And so now we've arrived at chapter 20, verses 1 to 15. Then I, John, saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit and locked and sealed it over him, so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be let out for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead evidently did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death had no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ. They will reign with him 1,000 years, a millennium. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They were as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were. And they will be tormented forever, night and day, forever and ever. So this series there is really the third, the fourth, and the fifth visions of this final series of visions. The third vision has Satan bound in chains and thrown into the bottomless pit for 1,000 years, for a millennium. And that's a significant period of time in Revelation. The fourth vision is of that 1,000-year or millennial reign of Christ. As much attention as the idea of this millennium receives in some writings about Revelation, there are only 3 verses in Revelation devoted to it. Those martyrs who had been beheaded were resurrected, the first resurrection, and they are the ones who reigned with Christ for the 1,000 years. Jerusalem was restored, and the temple apparently was rebuilt. And the fifth vision took place following or after that blissful millennium when Satan was released from the bottomless pit. And the reference to Ezekiel, a creature Gog of Magog, becomes now Gog and Magog in Revelation as the familiar story from Jewish history was retold. And from the four corners of the earth, the armies of the earth stormed toward Jerusalem. They were destroyed with fire from heaven. Satan, the devil, was defeated and thrown into the lake of fire with the Antichrist and the second beast. So continuing on in Revelation chapter 20, verses 11 to 15, then I, John, saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So this sixth vision, the faithful are gathered before God for judgment. The sixth vision had all the faithful, except the beheaded martyrs who were already resurrected, standing before the white throne. It appears they are in their physical bodies, or that's what it looks like. Their names were in the book of life, and they were all judged by their deeds recorded in all those other books. And then heaven and earth disappear. Death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, Gehenna, the garbage dump of Jerusalem. And this is the second permanent death, for all are not written in the book of life. Now all the evil has been destroyed and thrown into the landfill. And now we're into Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will dwell with them as their God. And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." And he said also this, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all the liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." So this is the seventh vision of the seventh series of visions, the new creation and God's eternal age. So history gets kind of mixed up here. It's transformed, or there's a new heaven and earth. John sees a brand new heaven and earth. The old had passed away. There's no sea. The new restored Jerusalem. There's some tradition that there's a new Eden, which has been restored as well, the Garden of Eden. The Jewish apocalyptic also has a pre-existent heavenly Jerusalem that's been waiting around, and it comes down at this point. But all this is to contrast with Rome versus the New Jerusalem. the harlot versus the bride. The song of blessing, in contrast to the dirge over the destruction of the earth and the city of Rome. See, the home of God is among mortals, and that's a reference back to Ezekiel 37:27. God is immanent rather than transcendent, here rather than off somewhere. God is incarnated. There's no more death, no more tears in God's new age. And again, refers back to Isaiah chapter 25, verse 8. There's a contrast of the present age of evil and strife in which those who receive this vision are living currently, and contrasting with the new age of God. Moses, Elijah, the elders, all those folks, they are not mentioned here. And the words, "it is done," refers to Revelation 16:17, but it's finally the fulfillment of God's purposes, God's promises. God is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. God has always been God from the beginning to the end. And he says to the thirsty, "I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life." And those who conquer, that is, those who remain faithful through the great persecution, these will inherit all of these things. And one last reminder of the consequence of sin, that all those liars, etc., will be thrown into the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. And now, Revelation chapter 21, verses 9 to 14. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues, you remember those angels? This angel came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And in the Spirit, he carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, coming down out of heaven from God. It has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It has a great high wall with 12 gates, and the gates 12 angels, and on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites. And on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, on the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates. And the wall of the city has 12 foundations, and on them are the 12 names of the apostles of the Lamb. So this is kind of, in my estimation, the Jubilee vision. You remember that after 7 series of 7 visions, we have this vision. Well, it's kind of analogous to me to the 7 times 7 years of the sabbatical law, 7 times 7 years, and then the 50th year is the Jubilee year. And this comes the Jubilee vision of the New Jerusalem. And one of those angels takes John in the Spirit to a high mountain, kind of carried in the Spirit. We saw that just a couple of chapters ago, and also back following the baptism of Jesus. He was carried by the Spirit, driven by the Spirit into the wilderness. They watched Jerusalem descend from heaven while they're standing on the mountain. And it is described as having the glory of God with radiance like a jewel. All the jewels and precious stones to which Jerusalem is compared, they're all crystal clear. It's just a picture of everything beautiful you could imagine, just the most glorious things. The New Jerusalem has a high wall. It's a fortified city like the great cities of antiquity. And the reference is to Ephesians 2:19-22, that Christ Jesus himself is the cornerstone. In him, the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord. And so we've seen the beginning of Jerusalem, and next time we'll see the remainder of this vision. Thank you, and God bless you.